So, I'm sitting in the gardens around the Victoria Memorial at Calcutta at the moment, and I thought that was probably an appropriate place to have a little bit of a chat about politics and empire, because these are things that are coming up quite a lot in my conversations with local people, far more so than when I visited 10 years ago. Now, one of the things that people have always said about trips to India is that how fondly the Indians remember the British, and that was particularly true, I found, when I was in Pakistan last year. There was this very dated view of the British, and it was very much of gentlemen, and the fact that the occupation, the empire, had not been altogether that bad a thing. And I've noticed a real shift this time, in that I've had several people, educated younger people, coming up to me and being very vocal about the crimes of the British Empire. And I don't know what to make of that. I mean, in one way, I think it's a really good thing, because it means that people are more aware of their history, and it means they're more aware that the rose-tinted view of Britain's occupation of India is not always prevailing, because at the end of the day there was some pretty horrible stuff that went on. You know, Amritsar is the famous example, but there are many more, and that's important, that's recognised, that empire wasn't this wonderful benevolent thing. That is to say, though, it of course did have some effects that were positive. I mean, where I am today, Calcutta's a beautiful city, and it's, you know, the beautiful buildings are largely part of the British Empire. They're a legacy of that. The railway system that I've been travelling on, which is excellent, you know, who built that? By and large, though, they do keep expanding it. And of course, I spent 2 days watching cricket, and I don't think that would have happened without the British. So, all in all, it is a mixed legacy. But what I find is interesting is something has changed in the Indian political discourse for these conversations to be happening. And India is a changed place politically. So when I was here 10 years ago, I remember having a ride with a taxi driver. I think it was in Amritsar. No, it wasn't. It was going from Agra to Fatehpur Sikri, I think. And the guy had said he was a BJP voter, and that BJP was the choice for the educated Indian. That was the way forward. And I'd never heard of this BJP. So when I got home, I looked them up, and I thought, well, I hope they don't get into power, because they sound pretty horrible. But of course they have. And one thing that is really obvious is that the current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has a lot of support, and it seems to be amongst younger people. So last night I had a conversation with some young men on the train, and they were very pro-Modi. And I was honest. I said, I don't think he's very good. And they were shocked. They were genuinely shocked. And then they were saying, oh, you're just saying that because you're a leftist. I'm like, no, not really. It's because his reputation's not very high abroad. And they were like, but everybody loves him. He's loved in America, he's loved in France, he's loved in... It's just you. And I'm like, no, that's not the case. And so I did say, well, you know, there was a documentary that he banned. Oh, is that the BBC one? Well, the BBC is leftist. And what they came out with was the kind of narrative that you would get from the hard right in Britain. So very anti-Muslim, but also very pro-Russian, very pro-Israel, very extremely anti-Muslim, and that is what seems to be a normalised narrative, and the surprising thing is amongst educated people. You know, you might expect it amongst non-educated people, but amongst educated people, that's that. They also are very pro-Trump as well, saying that Biden's ridiculous, nobody respects him, the world respects Trump. And I thought, well, I don't know what media you're watching, but I guess what it shows is that we are going into this multipolar world. And, you know, and what they said with some degree of, you know, honesty is, well, you know, India's growing at 7% a year. Who else is doing that? He must be doing something right. I mean, what I counted was he's living off the back of the reforms done by the former Prime Minister, the Congress one. But, you know, and they did actually say they quite liked him as well. But the thing is, in the West, we are presented a certain narrative. So I would say it is a Trump is bad, Biden is good narrative. It is also Putin is very bad and Zelensky is very good. And be wary of China. And of course, there are other narratives out there. And, you know, we talk about sanctioning Russia. You can't sanction Russia. It's a ridiculous idea. They shouldn't try doing it, because the fact is, yeah, so Europe blocks itself off, but it's trading with India. There's 1 billion people here. You know, it's trading with China. You know, anything can just come through here and then go off into the world anyway. You know, and I think what the Americans in particular have not realised is that in the noughties, you know, around the turn of the century, they were so dominant in world politics. And they think it's still the same, and it isn't. Something's changed. And forces like India are growing. Now, India isn't the great force that they think it is yet, but it will be. Interestingly, though, I do wonder how much it's addressed some of its bigger problems. I mean, the poverty here is overwhelming. Now, it always has been, and I appreciate that this is stuff that takes decades to change. So, Vietnam, for example, one of the poorest countries in the world after the war, you know, had the Doi Moi reforms in the early 1980s, and they've been having about 8% growth ever since. Now, Vietnam is not a developed country yet. It's a long way from where it was, though, and India is moving. Although the interesting thing is, I mean, Pakistan is much poorer, particularly on paper, but in everyday life you don't see that much of a difference. I would say Pakistan is a cleaner country in terms of, you know, keeping the roads clean and all that kind of stuff. What there isn't is the gross inequality. And the Indians have got to be careful, because if their economy grows but they don't take the majority of the population with them, that is going to be their stumbling block. And that's what the Chinese have done much better, is they've taken a lot of their population with them. They have created this vast middle class and, you know, wealthy working class, certainly urban working class. I don't know if India are doing that. They do talk about the growing middle class, but there is a lot of poverty here still. So there's a lot of work to be done, but, you know, conversely, you have to say that, you know, there is a lot that has been done. The absolute, basically well, it's fascism in terms of the rhetoric, is worrying, though. I mean, this is a country that is very into extreme nationalistic rhetoric, and I think this is where the anti-British thing's coming from. Interestingly, I've just been in there, and there was an exhibition on the history of Indian independence, and of course history is written by the victors. And when I was a child, we talked about the Indian Mutiny in 1857. It's not called the Indian Mutiny here, it's called the Indian War of Independence of 1857. Interestingly, I think both titles are probably really wrong. The Indian Mutiny, you know, mutiny suggests treason, which I guess it was in terms of the established order, but, you know, for ordinary people, they were rising up against oppression. Or at least their Rajas were. But I don't think it was an Indian War of Independence, because I think the actual concept of India then was not really in people's minds. I think the Rajas just wanted the British out, and they wanted what they had before, which was not modern India. So both sides are rewriting history for their own ends and doing it, in my opinion, quite inaccurately. And it'll be interesting to see. I'd be very interested as to what do the children and grandchildren think of the Modi generation, because will they look at them as, perhaps we look at those who voted Thatcher as selfish and short-sighted, or will they look at them as the people who, made India great? I suspect it will be, in the next 50 years it will be made India great, but in 100 years time, or 80 years time, it will be, what were they thinking? I really do think that. But Narendra Modi is everywhere. There's elections this year. He will get back in. He is like, one of those third world dictators. His picture is literally everywhere, and he's locked down the media. Anything that is not pro him is, leftist. It's out beyond the pale. And there's this narrative. I mean, obviously, I guess most Indians don't travel that the world loves him. And it doesn't. I mean, let's be honest, anywhere you go in the world, they can't stand the guy. So, but, that message is not being heard in India, which I think is really interesting. So I think it'll be something to watch. I mean, because you see these populists all over the place. We've got one in Argentina now, and there was the one in Brazil, they voted him out. There's one in the Philippines. Maybe Trump gets back in. And the thing is, I don't think the left at the moment's got an answer, because the left's too timid to actually do anything. So, in Britain we'll probably get Keir Starmer in, as the Americans got Biden in. But what will he actually change? Whereas the right is emboldened, the right is prepared to make radical change. The problem is it's radical change that will lead nowhere. It's ethno-nationalist, it's toxic, and it can only cause disaster. And so maybe this is a period of tribulation, an age of Kali that we've got to go through before better times come. I hope not. I hope things can be a lot better. Anyway, that's my little politics talk. I'm going to go and explore a bit more. Keep travelling. Greetings, Uncle Travelling Matt, and I'm recording this at home after my India trip, and it's a kind of addition to the interlude I did on politics, because I thought what I said there I still hold by, but more happened on the trip to give me a bit of a deeper insight into the Modi era. And so I wanted to add a few thoughts that I perhaps hadn't expressed in that bit. So firstly, travelling through the country, everything I found in that early stage continued. There is mass popularity, but with it comes really, really hard right rhetoric about Muslims. Now, the thing is, in Britain, it's often presented as he's very anti-minorities, and particularly Christians, and, anti-Christian conversion. And that may be true, but what seems to be the main recurring theme when you're in India is about Muslims. So the amount of Hindus I spoke to who said, my daughter could marry a Christian or a Sikh, I wouldn't have a problem with that, but not a Muslim. No, they're backward, the way they deal with women and all that. And a lot of this, I mean, some of it might have been present anyway, probably was, but I think it's been exacerbated by the Modi regime. However, flipping it around, what a lot of people who were praising Modi said was not so much about his Hinduism ideology, but about infrastructure. And this is the big point I didn't make before. Whatever faults Modi might have, he seems to have gone big into investing in infrastructure. I saw that as I travelled across the country, but also on the final day, final couple of days in Delhi, I started looking at newspapers. I bought a couple of newspapers, and literally every day there's a full-page announcement of all the infrastructure projects that are going on. And these are things like railway electrification, the Vande Bharat Expresses, which I talked about, which is that program keeps expanding. But also highways, metro systems. So I'll give you an example. Patna, which only has 1.5 million people, is getting a metro system, and it was part built by the time I went there. And then there was a highway being driven up to Dharamshala. So, it was a really tortuous bus journey. But next time, if I ever go there again, it'll be dead easy. There's a big highway going up. And I think they're trying to bring a railway there? Certainly, they have built a railway, a very expensive one, into Kashmir. Now, okay, there are political reasons for doing that, but a bit like the Chinese with Tibet. But nonetheless, there is massive infrastructure investment. So, and I went to the cricket. I mean, the stadia are pretty top notch. I mean, the one in Dharamsala is fairly new. It's a city of only 100,000 people. Apparently, the sports minister is from Himachal Pradesh, and he likes everyone to know that. His pictures were everywhere. But people were really proud of their stadium. They said, we have the most beautiful stadium in the world. And look, it's bringing in tourists. There were 5,000 English people there. And they were there because they'd seen it on TV and thought, if I go to one test match abroad, it'll be there. And so this infrastructure investment works. And this is almost my plea to Western politicians. Like, invest. We ever since neoliberalism came along, we're so scared to spend government money on anything. And in Britain, we have this ridiculous debacle of HS2. HS2 should have been built in the 80s or the 70s. And instead, it's now in the 2020s, and they're like, well, okay, we'll build it only as far as Manchester and Leeds. It shouldn't be all the way to Scotland. It should be in Wales. And then they're like, well, actually, we won't build Leeds. Okay, actually, we won't build Manchester either. We'll just have a truncated line to Birmingham. I mean, and there's been so much controversy over that. And we can't build anything in this country. And yet, actually, if you invest, it creates jobs, it creates pride. I mean, our railway trains are all bought in from Japan. Why don't we build our own train like the Indians have done? And he creates this pride. Yeah, okay, some of it's toxic nationalism, I get that. But also, investing in his country and saying, and also, this is what we've done. And, Patna has a metro system and cities the same size in Britain don't. And that's a bit ridiculous. So, I think that is a big element of Modi's way of working that we don't appreciate. We see the negative side, but we don't see that investment in lives. They also put a lot of money into making India far more digitally connected. And it noticeably is far more digitally plugged in. There's lots of cashless payments and stuff compared with Pakistan. Also, Pakistan, far less infrastructure, and the infrastructure that there is, it's obviously paid for by the Chinese. And so that is a huge contrast between the two countries. Another point I want to make is about the attitude towards Muslims and Islam. Now, as I said already, there's a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric floating around. And there are laws that have been passed, including at the very moment, there's a citizenship law that is seen to be uniquely anti-Islamic. That because the citizenship law says that, Hindus and Buddhists and other people under persecution will be allowed into India, but not specifically not Muslims, so not the Rohingya, for example. And I think you could call that anti-Islamic. But when I spoke to a Muslim friend in Delhi, he said, I need to be a bit more careful about how I see this. And he said, because in the past, because they're trying to get the Muslim vote, other parties have pandered to more extreme elements of Islam, whereas Modi obviously doesn't do that. And he said, for example, there's a law being passed at the moment, and a Hindu taxi driver had mentioned this. And I actually think somebody else had mentioned it as well. And it is a law against the triple talaq divorce. So triple talaq is where the man, and it's only the man who can do it, says, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you to the woman. And he can even do it over the phone or something. And she's divorced with no recourse. And what this law is doing is making that illegal. And what my Muslim friend in Delhi had said is he said, well, look, why are you defending stuff like that? He said, actually, who's helped Muslim women more? Modi, by getting rid of that, or the parties that, in a sort of an appeasement thing, left it alone. And I think that's very interesting, because I would say I'm not anti-Islamic, but there are certain practices that go on in Britain. So, for example, in Britain, there are polygamous marriages, well, that's actually against the law in Britain, but a kind of blind eye's turned to it. Who does that actually help? But because, I guess, for the same reasons as the opposition parties in India wouldn't, British law just doesn't touch that stuff because we don't get involved in community stuff. And in my opinion, all that does is give fuel for the far right. So I do think that was interesting that there was a Muslim defending him. And this guy, at the same time was saying, but, some of their rhetoric is horrendous and they go way too far. Of course, on a similar level, what I've not talked about is the Ayodhya controversy. So Ayodhya is very interesting. So basically, Ayodhya is one of the 7 Hindu holy cities. And it's holy because that is where the god Ram is said to have been born, right? And the site of his temple where he was born, Aurangzeb, who was a notably bigoted Mughal emperor. I mean, I've come across him before, and it's never good. He demolished, I think, this Hindu temple and built a mosque, right? And then, about 20 odd years ago, Hindu extremists demolished this mosque illegally, and there was a big court case of what to do because they wanted to rebuild the Ram temple. And in the end, the court decided it should be, half the site should go to the Muslims, half should go to the Hindus. But then, one of Modi's election promises was, we'll get the Ram temple built. And he came in and he reversed the court's decision and gave it all to the Hindus, although he didn't pay for the temple, and it was actually part of the biggest crowdfunding project in Indian history. And this Ram temple built. Now, this is presented in the West as being this example of Hindu bigotry where they're, attacking another religion. And I think you can say it is. However, what is not understood in the West is just how much this means to the average Hindu. So I was talking to a German chap in Bahrain airport on the way back, and he was in Nepal when the temple opened, because it's only just opened. He said people were in the streets crying. They were so happy. And literally everywhere in India, again, Modi is a publicist, so, he makes sure everyone knows about it, but everybody is so happy about this. And actually, the religious significance of this Ram temple is huge. So the nearest correlation I can think of, and it's not a brilliant one, would be if, extremists blew up the Dome of the Rock, or Al-Aqsa, and then the Jews rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. Now, not a great correlation because actually the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa are very, very significant to Muslims, whereas this mosque in Ayodhya wasn't. But nonetheless, it's the best I can come up with. And the Ram temple is massive, and it's been a massive vote winner for him. And, and at the end of the day, yes, it's bigoted, but then so was the act that demolished it in the first place. Of course, the worry is how far does it go? There's another one, as I mentioned, in Varanasi. Is that next? Is that going to be next? It may not be because Modi's already spent up money doing the area around it to create a safe corridor from the city streets to the Ghats. But, there are a lot of police guards in it, and there are very few Muslims worshipping in that mosque. So is that next? How far does this go? And I think, is this something Modi's saving for when he needs the votes later on? He didn't need them now. Is he saving it for when he does? I do wonder about that. And, where do you stop with this? Because the problem is all over India, there are places that were Hindu temples that were demolished in the Mughal era and made into mosques. Indeed, when I went to Delhi, I went to Qutub Minar. It's an incredible place. But according to Gulab, the guy I went with, there is an inscription there that says 27 idol temples, as in Hindu temples, were demolished to make this mosque, and that's the boast. So where does it stop? So I think that's a very interesting aspect. It's not as clear-cut as I thought. It still leaves me uneasy, though. So that is essentially my main observation on Modi. I am reading a book at the moment called Saffron Storm, which is by a Muslim author. She's a journalist, but she's talking about the rise of the BJP. So I'm going to try and understand it more. I think this is a topic I will probably return to, certainly if I return to India. But yes, really interesting, and I think that whatever happens, I think Modi will be in for a generation. The question will be who follows him. Will there be somebody of equal charisma? And also, a bit like Thatcherism, when its failings became clear, people were far less enamored than they were at the time. And, now I think our generation looks back on them and seeing them as a bit selfish, a bit short sighted. Will the next generation see that about the Modi generation or not? We don't know. Because alternatively, they could see them as in the Doi Moi generation or the Deng Xiaoping generation in China, where they see them as having moved their country forward in a positive way. We shall see. It'll be interesting watching Some Travelling Matt. Keep travelling.